Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. The wife and child of a Hamas leader have been reportedly killed in an Israeli airstrike on their home in Gaza. The attack also saw the death of 9 other Palestinians. Hamas says that Israel has been targeting Mohammed Deif, who's the head of its armed wing. Saidia Chowdhury has been following today's developments.
Just hours before a fragile ceasefire was due to expire, hostilities resumed across the Israel-Gaza border, and neither side appeared keen to show any sign of starting slow. Israel says about 50 rockets had been fired yesterday from Gaza, and this morning reported another 20, saying some of them had been intercepted by its sophisticated Iron Dome system. No injuries have been reported as Israelis survey for any damage. On the Palestinian side, it's hard not to notice the war that is upon them. This is the aftermath of a strike that killed 7 members of one family. The bomb landed in the early hours of this morning, and among those killed were a woman and 3 children.
عائلة كاملة الزوج والزوجة والأولاد 3 واللي في بطنها هذه عائلة كاملة استهدف الاحتلال الإسرائيلي دون أي مبرر دون أي سابق إنذار.
In Rafah, another strike caused large-scale destruction after a building was completely destroyed and other nearby buildings damaged.
زي ما انتم شايفين الدمار دمار فظيع زلزال كان ضرب المنطقة الجميع اتضرر كل السكان اتضرروا الدور المدنية الناس الآمنين تبهدلت بدون أي ذنب.
بقينا نايمين في البيت احنا والصغار وما فيش شيء يعني فجأة صار قصف بدون انذار وتم إصابتنا يعني كامل إصابة العائلة بالكامل.
Several wounded children were taken to a local hospital. Israel has refused to comment on the killings and wouldn't specify any of the targets of 60-something attacks in Gaza. The violence shattered a 10-day period of calm since a first truce brokered by Egypt. That had come after about a month of violence in which 67 Israelis and over 2,000, mainly Palestinian civilians, were killed. Israel accuses Gaza's fighters of breaking the truce, saying rockets had been fired into Israel 8 hours before the ceasefire was to have expired. The country recalled its negotiators from truce talks in Cairo last night, leaving the fate of efforts to secure a lasting peace hanging in the balance. Palestinian negotiators walked out of the talks later, blaming Israel for the failure. And after accusing Israel of opening a gateway to hell, Hamas fired rockets at Tel Aviv. It had been a brief respite for Palestinians who'd spent much of the last 10 days picking up the pieces of the month-long violence. The United Nations had warned that Gaza's residents faced more misery if negotiations to end the war and lift the blockade weren't successful.
The question would be, is it a ceasefire that brings us simply back to the pre-existing conditions under the blockade? If that is the case, it will take years and years and years to rebuild because the rhythm of importation of material that we had seen previously is so slow.
More than 50 people in Gaza have been wounded in the strikes since violence resumed last night. Beyond this, major elements of Gaza's infrastructure have been completely destroyed. Its only power station, its water treatment center and agricultural lands lie completely useless. Some estimates say it could cost up to £6 billion to rebuild the homes, roads and bridges. The United Nations says its priority now is to take care of the nearly 500,000 people who've been made homeless and who remain in urgent need of shelter, food and medical aid.
Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Ben Jamal, who's an Executive Committee member at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And on Skype, we're joined by Professor Yossi Mechelberg, who's an Associate Fellow at the Middle East and North African Programme at the Chatham House think tank. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Ben, why has this ceasefire broken down now?
I mean, I suppose it's difficult to say in terms of we don't have full details. We have some sense of what were the demands that Israel has brought to the table. It seems that Israel has brought a demand that Hamas be completely disarmed, which I would say is a completely unrealistic demand. Hamas has brought a demand that the siege be lifted. I would have to say, based on the information we have, but what we know from previous negotiations, whether over ceasefires, whether over so-called peace talks, one has to doubt Israel's serious commitment to enter the negotiations with a view to actually finding a solution that addresses the core issues.
Professor Meckelberg, I mean, the point that was made in that package by the UN spokesperson when they said, look, unless there is a lifting of the siege, the time it would take to simply rebuild the damage under previous conditions would be unacceptably long. That's true, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe about your previous question about why the ceasefire broke down. The first thing, they don't break down, they just come to an end. It's one of these situations that is a time-limited ceasefire, which is quite uncommon in international relations. And it doesn't let the negotiators enough time actually to negotiate because, as one would expect, both sides are start from positions that are quite extreme, trying to, or maximalists, and then in the process of negotiations, they come closer or not. But when you have 24 hours, 72 hours ceasefires or truce, there's not even time to build this negotiation dynamic as needed. And as for the situation in Gaza, it's obviously this is abnormal situation, and 1.8 million people live in unacceptable condition, which to a large extent caused by the Israeli siege or blockade or whatever name it's done, but it's deprived the people of Gaza from access to the wild world. And in terms of goods, in terms of finance, in terms of people, and this is unacceptable. But of course, the Hamas contributes to that quite significantly, and with that also Egypt. So there is a place here just to negotiate all of this and come to a conclusion, a positive conclusion, without it, we'll be in the same position again and again.
What do you make of the scale on which hostilities have been resumed? Because it's certainly not yet back at the levels that we saw at the height of the previous engagement. So do you think there's a process of kind of armed negotiation going on here, even though the direct discussions have broken down?
Both sides try to force the hand of the other side and there is all correlation between the amount of force that each is using, because it's unfortunately part of their negotiation technique or tactics. In other words, using force, showing they can still standing and can keep inflicting harm on one another. The attempt to assassinate Mohammed Deif, which is escalation on the Israeli side. The Hamas says today that they try to hit some gas installations, Israeli gas installation. And the problem is one of the problems is both of them are so invested now militarily because of the amount of sacrifice. They are trying actually to gain something around the negotiation table to justify it. And instead of reaching an agreement, they escalate the military action.
Ben, what do you make of the balance of forces at the end of this? Because there are some commentators, Paul Rogers, for instance, at the Bradford University School of Peace Studies, who are saying that actually Israel came off very badly in this, not just in public relations terms, but even militarily, even though they have the overwhelming superiority in arms, even though they inflicted an overwhelming damage on the Palestinians compared to any losses on the Israeli side, still the argument goes they didn't come off well out of this.
It's difficult to put a context on that, isn't it? Because in a sense you need to know, I think the question there is what's the Israeli mindset in terms of what it considers acceptable losses. It's certainly true that in terms of the scale of casualties, of soldiers killed, it significantly exceeded what they would have expected and what has happened in previous engagements. I think I'm right in saying outside of Lebanon in 2006. The question of to what extent does that impact upon Israel's thinking, I guess, is then a question of to what extent does that have resonance within public support in Israel, etc. We're not seeing that shifting. Certainly, you know, to me, the overriding context is still, as you've said, we have an overwhelming imbalance in terms of the scale of forces across the two sides. So in a sense, trying to see whose forces have taken a greater loss has to be considered within that broader sort of context.
Professor Merkelberg, I mean, you mentioned Egypt. I mean, but Egypt's hardly a kind of neutral broker here. I mean, the El-Sisi regime has perhaps even exceeded the Mubarak regime in its hostility towards Hamas, hasn't it?
Definitely, but as much as the Hamas doesn't see Egypt as a natural or honest broker, it is a reality. Without Egypt being a partner in all of this, it won't work. They need Egypt to be also invested in an agreement, because they're in control of the Rafah crossing, and they have impact of what happens in Gaza. Agreements and done usually not necessarily between friends, but between enemies, between people, between countries or political entities that disagree. It's about the interest of this triangle of Gaza or Palestine in the wider sense, Egypt in Israel, which will actually determine the nature of this agreement. But we can't ignore Egypt is a very important component in this.
I mean, that's certainly true that they're an important component, Ben. But I mean, if you're the Palestinian delegation, you must be going into the room thinking, okay, I'm going to negotiate with my enemy, but my other enemy is chairing this meeting?
Exactly. I mean, I would agree with what Yossi has said, that in a sense, you know, if one's looking at, in a sense, one of the important but narrow issues, which is how do we end the current conflict in terms of Israel's assault, Hamas's response to that. If we broaden that to a discussion of how do we lift the siege, it's impossible to look at those issues without looking at the involvement of Egypt, because of its role in sustaining the blockade. So certainly Egypt has to be involved in the process, but for those reasons, because it is a party that in effect is enforcing a certain position, it's not in a position to be an honest broker, as you say. So in a sense, what's missing from this discussion is an honest broker.
Do you think there is one on the horizon? Because, I mean, you know, Egypt are kind of sitting in that chair, aren't they?
Look, there might be, I think, a range of possibilities. There is not the will within the international community to actually create the circumstances in which an honest broker could emerge. We've seen this through the pattern of the so-called peace process over the last 20 years, where the quartet, led by the US, has not been an honest broker because of all of the factors that sustain the US's consistent support for Israel. So in a sense, the international community has stood aside and said we will allow there to be a process of discussions without there being an honest broker. Now, we can take a sort of realpolitik view about that, but actually if we want to shift the situation, then we actually need to look at how can we change that dynamic and how can we actually start to exert some pressure on Israel.
Well, with the failure of the peace talks between Israel and Hamas, attention is being cast on the British government's response to the conflict. Earlier this month, a review of British export licences to Israel found that 12 licences could be used for military-related equipment. The issue at stake is whether the equipment is being used by Israel against Gaza. The review was conducted during the ceasefire, and it concluded that if significant hostilities resumed, the licences would be suspended. The Campaign Against the Arms Trade today called for the licence to be revoked, indicating that the trade might be unlawful. This comes amid criticism of Israel by the European Union and the United Nations. We contacted the government today, and a spokesman said, "We would suspend licences if there were a significant resumption of hostilities. We're closely monitoring the situation. Our assessment so far is that the resumption of hostilities has been limited." So, is this an adequate response? Well, we've now been joined in the studio by Andrew Smith from the Campaign Against the Arms Trade. Welcome to the programme, Andrew. So, the government's got itself into a bit of a tight corner here, hasn't it? Because it said it's going to cancel these licences if there is a resumption of hostilities, and now it's saying, well, they haven't resumed enough.
Well, the response from government is extremely weak. In fact, it's beyond that, it's pathetic. I don't know what reasonable definition they could possibly be using of significant hostilities. In the last 24 hours, we've seen 19 people dying from airstrikes. I think to most people that represents a resumption of significant hostilities.
I mean, Ben, that's right, isn't it? I mean, we've just seen on the video package at the head of the programme, there are craters the size of a considerable tower block in the ground. If that isn't a resumption of hostilities, it's hard to know what is.
Yeah, and maybe that becomes clear if we are asked the question, if there had been no hostilities before yesterday and these actions took place, would the international community be saying we have a serious problem in terms of what's happening in Gaza, we have serious hostilities breaking out in Gaza? Of course they would. So it seems that there's an interpretation that is suiting the government's underlying intentions, I think.
I mean, Qatar are taking the government to court over this, aren't they?
We certainly are. I mean, even by the government's own definitions, there's a case to be answered for. Vince Cable and the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills have already said that there are 12 licences which they have reasonable grounds to suspect have been used in Gaza. And this isn't us saying it, this is the government saying it. And of course our point is that we shouldn't even be in this situation, because arms should never have been sold in the first place. In 2009, the then Foreign Secretary David Miliband made a parliamentary statement in which he said it was almost certain that UK components had been used in the bombardment of Gaza that year. And at that point, of course, he said, we'll review all licences and want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And of course, 5 years later, we're in the exact same position. And it can't happen again.
Have they got jammed up because there's a kind of conflict within the government between the Liberal Democrats and the Tories over this? Because Danny Alexander made a very similar statement just over the weekend. Raytheon's up there in Scotland, shipping the stuff out to Israel. Is this part of pre-election positioning?
Well, I've no doubt that there is a conflict in government. We saw Baroness Barcy, who's hardly a radical, resigning from cabinet on the grounds that she thought the government's position was morally indefensible. And I know that a lot of Liberal Democrats and Liberal Democrat ministers are probably appalled by what's happening in Gaza. But this is a department Vince Cable has responsibility for. Vince Cable isn't just a backbencher. He is the government minister in charge of the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. He has got to do what he sees as right, and if he thinks that there should be a suspension of these licences, it's the very least he could do.
I mean, Ben, do you see this as a kind of, if you like, kind of top-end extension of the boycott, disinvestment and sanctions campaign, which is gathering momentum? Now, when it's hit the cabinet and they're talking like this, we're talking about a very effective campaign indeed, aren't we?
Well, we're seeing, and I think there is a strong sense, so there's been quite a push from a number of organisations on the issue of the arms embargo, both because of the immediacy of the issue, but also because of a sense of this is an issue that has specific leverage. And for the reasons that Andrew's raised, I would say that the broader issue of our financial support for Israel is unsupportable. But actually, the process of selling arms to a state that is carrying out the actions that Israel is carrying out is entirely indefensible. But there is also a sense of a wider leverage now for a narrative around boycott, divestment, sanctions, and we're seeing that in a huge range of areas, across the cultural boycott, across specific boycotts in the UK, and specifically in relation to the arms embargo as well.
I mean, Andrew, it's very noticeable the sort of dual standards here, because if these companies were shipping this stuff, say, to the Syrian government, or indeed to Putin's Russia, we've already seen a sort of immediate reaction from the government. So it tells us something about the sort of special status that Israel holds with the government, doesn't it?
Well, even in the case of Russia, actually, even after the government announced its own suspension, arms sales have continued to Russia. I think that what we're seeing is that there's a double standard which, when it comes to the arms trade, which is that the government is perfectly happy to talk about promoting human rights and democracy, but is also perfectly happy to sell large quantities of weapons to governments which are undermining human rights and democracy. And of course, arms sales to Israel don't just provide military support, they provide a strong political support as well. And they provide a message that the UK government thinks this is okay, and the UK government is providing that support and that fig leaf of respectability for the collective punishment displacement of people in Gaza.
Ben, in a way, we would just have to wait and see, I guess, to answer this question. But what's your judgment? If the hostilities become any more intense now that the truce has broken down, do you think the government will be forced to do this now that it's put its sort of, its sort of head on the line, so to say?
That will depend on a number of dynamics. I think one is the extent to which the sea change in public opinion, the strong expression of public opinion through a number of mediums, the extent to which that continues. That is certainly having impact across the political parties. We know, just through PSC, we know that MPs have received over 50,000 letters that we know about. There are vastly more than that. We know that's starting to have an impact as we approach an election. We know that's filtering through. Andrew's talked about the impact of Baroness Varsi's resignation. So, in a sense, to what extent will that shift government policy depends to some extent to what extent is that momentum kept up.
OK. Well, we're going to have to go for a break now, but do rejoin us for the second half of the programme. We'll be looking at more of today's top stories, as well as the dangers that face journalists reporting in conflict zones. More on those after the break. Do rejoin us.